Today we are talking with David Kim. David is the author of Made to Belong, Five Practices for Cultivating Community in a Disconnected World. David, I was wondering if you could introduce yourself. You're also a pastor, and share about the story about how your best friend broke up with you.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. My name is David, and I'm a pastor of discipleship and formation at Westgate Church here in Silicon Valley. And I was actually born in South Korea. I came to the States when I was 10 years old. And little did I know that everything would just change right before my eyes. I had new community, friends, church, neighborhood, school. And I think as a child, I didn't have the tools in which to navigate my pain of loneliness. And I had a good friend who became my best friend, Paul, and he really leaned into our friendship and cared for me and showed me what America is all about. And I don't think I knew how to be a good friend to him. And we went through our middle school and high school together. And on my way to college, he wrote me this letter, and I thought I was going to read it and say, "Hey, David, thanks for being such a wonderful friend. I love you, and I'm going to miss you." And I opened it, and he said, "Hey, David, I don't want to be friends with you anymore. You're a terrible friend." And see ya. And that really caught me off guard. And I think that began a journey of self-reflection to see, am I a good friend, and am I doing this right? And I still remember that letter.
Yeah. So that was a story from your past. Obviously, you've learned a lot since then, and you're able to write a book about it. This experience of loneliness, you were able to kind of talk about it in terms of a false connection cycle. I was wondering if you could share that with our audience, just really quickly, give an overview of it, but and then also try to relate it to an Asian American context if you're able to do that.
Yeah, so the false connection that I write in my book is that we first kind of isolate from our community, which leads to loneliness. And then we end up pursuing false connections that promise belonging and satisfaction. And I'll talk about that. And then lastly, we feel anxious and lonely from the lack of real intimacy and belonging from those false connections. And for many of us, when I was growing up, I didn't know there were false connections at the time. I was involved in everything and anything from gaming, online gaming, StarCraft and Counter-Strike, to poker and gambling, to pornography and food and eating and all of those things. Again, I didn't know at the time, but I was just soothing of my pain of loneliness. And they had these invitation or the promises of satisfaction and belonging. And more and more I explored into them. What I realized is that it promised me and it gave me actually emptiness and more despair. And I think I'm not the only one in that journey. Many of us have used these tools to kind of cope with our pain. But instead of giving us deep meaning, it actually backfires on us. And we become more and more frustrated, if we're honest.
Yeah. So this loneliness cycle, I mean, for you, you've talked about how you went to different things, right? Games, online poker. I remember those examples stood out to me. What do you think your Korean identity had anything to do with this? Because in your book, you're very upfront and open
Yeah.
about your Korean identity. Two questions, I guess, from that. The first one being, what made you feel like, oh, you want to talk about this in your book, that identity? Because you didn't have to, right? You could have just started writing and not have your cultural ethnic background play into it at all. But you decided to put that, what I believe is almost like upfront in the book. So yeah, why did you choose to do that? And then was it hard for you to think through like how that affected how you experienced loneliness and things like that?
Whew, okay, lots in there. So
Yeah.
I would say first and foremost, I believe that Korean Americans and Asian American story has a unique purpose in not only our own individual lives, but for the gospel and in God's kingdom. Meaning that I think our experiences really can be a incredible wisdom and resource for the larger, broader evangelical Christianity.
Mm.
Growing up, I read many of the authors who are great, but just many white American authors thinking, and I went to seminary, and that's kind of how it was shaped and informed my theology, and I'm grateful for that. But I believe that there are unique perspectives and wisdom and insight that Asian Americans can bring to the conversations about theology and Christian faith,
Mm.
particularly, I believe, about community. The reason for that is for us, we immigrated here and we weren't given community. We had to build and forge community.
Mm.
And so for us, we think about the Maslow's hierarchy. It's not just the physical needs and then shelter and all that, and then get into belonging. For us, belonging actually comes first. We find our community, and through our community, we get all the right information and resources around our own neighborhood and our cities. And so I think actually we have much to offer about how to build meaningful community. I'm not saying we do it rightly all the time, and we have our own brokenness, and I can share about that in a bit. But I would say there's incredible wisdom. So I wanted to make that clear that I'm writing from an Korean American, Asian American, Christian perspective, number one. And I would say, kind of going back to that false connection cycle,
Right.
I think for us, where it gets really tricky is that a lot of our belonging, now this is the negative side of the kind of the Korean American or Asian American Christian faith, is that it can become transactional, meaning if you achieve or if you get good grades, we will now accept you in our own family or to that school or to that church community. And so much of our belonging and community is dependent on how well we do. And I think that really shapes how we build and forge relationships for the worse.
Yeah.
And so all of that I wanted to kind of share and bring it to our conversation.
Yeah, and I'm with you 100%. I love that you were so upfront with your identity in this, and it definitely caused me to think about how my own upbringing kind of contributed to any feelings of loneliness or even that getting into that cycle. Was it hard for you to write about those things with your identity? Like, did you really have to think it through? Was this something that you've already been thinking through, or yeah, how did this play out when you were actually doing the writing?
Yeah, I guess what I realized is that now I've been a pastor for over 20 years, and that loneliness for me wasn't just a Korean American immigrant experience, as I served, again, for the most part in a Korean American church context, and now I'm in a multi-ethnic church. But wherever that may be, everybody is struggling and dealing and facing loneliness and wanting deeper community. And so, yes, it was difficult for me to process and journey, but I realized that as I'm trying to pastor our folks, especially post our pandemic world, I realized that this is a similar pain that many of us have. And especially in Silicon Valley, people, they say people don't come here for relationships, they come for work, right? They come to make something of themselves. And so I think because we all share the similar pain, I think pastorally, it was something that I really wanted to write and excavate into kind of the deeper pains of my soul. So ended up being a good, painful few years.
That's something else that you brought up in your book too, the whole Silicon Valley aspect of it too. Tell me about that. Tell me more about that. I know you already started talking about it, but why is it that you think that it's strong feelings of loneliness over there?
Yeah, I think, man, so much to talk about, but I think first we live in an incredibly busy culture. I mean, everyone can kind of relate to that, but especially in Silicon Valley, the traffic and the 60, 70, 80 hours of work in our tech world, and to grind and to make it to the kind of the next level is really a big pressure here. And for any of the startups that you're working in, you don't know if it's going to be a successful startup. So you have to put in significant amount of energy behind it. So busyness could be a factor. I also think we live in a transient city. So hyper mobile city means that you'll be here for a few years and you'll leave. And so not many folks are all in, here to stay, kind of a mantra. They're kind of just dipping the toes, and they're not really committing too much. And I also think we live in a non-committal culture, and we have many options. And so we're kind of, we're not really committing to one church. We're kind of exploring like 4 or 5 churches, and whatever that suits my own personality and flavor. And so just with all of those challenges, I think there is a invitation for us to build deeper community. And I think it's really important. And if we're not careful, we will continue to drift away into isolation and self-sufficiency.
Yeah, I hate to say it, right? But it sounds like due to your cultural background and due to your placement in Silicon Valley, you are the perfect person to write about this and to have to experience it and to go through it. So
because I've been a terrible person. And no, it's true. And so these are mainly just my own personal growth edges. And I realize, oh my goodness, if I don't really do this, this is gonna really impact my discipleship to Jesus in a significant way, right? And so that was really the centerpiece, that my formational pathway. Yes, I love theology. Yes, I love Bible study. Yes, I have seminary degree. But at the end of the day, if I don't build community and accountability, I am left alone, and I begin to believe the lie that I can live this world alone.
I mean, even though the book is very personal to you, though, I did find many aspects of it relatable, specifically an area where you talk about small groups, and you talked about how you've seen poorly modeled small groups, and I definitely have seen that in my church contexts before. I want to ask you if you can talk about what would be healthy small groups, so you can talk about both unhealthy and what would be healthy. And then I do want you to ask you specifically if you can tap into that Korean side of you and then say how can we like you know the pitfalls that come with the culture, right? So how can we combat those things?
So that's kind of my main emphasis of the book. I really wrote my book for small groups and small group leaders who are building and forging communities, and pastors who care deeply about moving from a shallow community to deep, transformative community. And I had small group leaders in mind. So as I share about small groups, I am critiquing the very thing that I love, and I oversee small groups in my church. And so please hear me when I say I love small groups, but they are often just a non-thoughtful machine that we've just created to shove people in these smaller groups so that they stay at our church, if we're really being honest. But the goal of small group is formation into Christ-likeness through deep care and love and support. And so what I realize is that we need to learn how to build community. We know that it's important to us, but no one has really taught us how to forge community. So I talk about in my book 5 practices to forging community: priority, chemistry, vulnerability, empathy, and accountability. And they are built in order. And but I mean, definitely I could talk my entire few hours on this in this podcast, but what I will say is this: in these 5 practices to forge deep, meaningful community, now I'm gonna talk about specifically the Korean American or the Asian American context. The one that I think we fall apart is vulnerability. I think when you're trying to build small groups, and if your leader or if your pastor is not vulnerable, is not honest because of their position or their power or their title, and I've seen this over and over again, and I've seen this in my own life, right? I would tell people to be honest, but I can't be honest because of my own shame, my pride, my title, my position, maybe potential gossip at Per Spaghetti or judgment or whatever that may be, that may come in my way. And so what we end up doing is, in our small groups, we regurgitate content, which isn't bad, but we talk about content from afar, but we never talk about how the content, the teachings of Jesus, is really deeply impacting and challenging some of the things that we are wrestling honestly and able to verbalize that for our people that we're doing life with. And because we're not vulnerable and we are filled with shame and pride, I think our communities tend to just have shallow conversations, if we're honest.
Yeah. Well, how can we fight that? How can we go against that tendency to put up, those walls? How would you give advice on how to fight that tendency?
Man, again, I talk about it more in my book, and I get that some of you come from church hurt, right? And you've been vulnerable, but you've been met with gossip and abuse and betrayal, and I get that, and I'm mindful of that conversation. At the same time, I think vulnerability is how you create safe spaces, and vulnerability's got to always start with your leadership. It's got to start with your lead pastor. It's got to start with your pastors. It's got to start with your small group leaders. We cannot lead somewhere that we haven't been. And we cannot say this is a safe place unless you have modeled that safe place for others. And safety comes through confession and vulnerability, because we can relate not to all of your successes, but we can relate to a lot of our brokenness, because we are all broken by sin and need of Jesus and the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so I would say vulnerability's got to be modeled by our leaders, and that's really how I think real community is formed.
Yeah, I love it. I love it. That's something that I want to apply after reading that in your book and after hearing it from you personally. That's really impactful. I want to keep this. I want to keep this on a personal level. You've talked about in your book isolation being a seasonal gift. Okay, and so maybe moments of isolation in somebody's life. Well, for me, it's been difficult to maybe find consistent community because I have young kids. Now, my question for you is that a season of isolation, and how can I get out of that? Yeah, I'm asking for practical help here for my own personal life. Yeah.
So I have two girls as well, and so I can relate. I think for young parents, again, you guys are battling all sorts of front, and as a young parent myself, I have so much empathy on that front. Here's what I would say, as I'm also pastoring a ton of young parents here at Westgate Church. Okay. Number one is that while we do understand your lack of sleep and your inability to carve out time to come to small groups, I would say number one is that when you are forging and building your own family and you're going through the chaos of raising kids, that's actually when you need the support of your community all the more. So I would say, even though I get the sleepless nights, I think kind of finding a space for community matters, because you do need the support of your people even more than you've ever had in your life. So that's number one. And number two, practically, how does that work is you could do it in multiple ways. So number one is I meet my men's group on Tuesday, and my wife has her small group on Thursday. And so we rotate. So on Tuesday, she watches the kid, and I go and I do my small group, and then I watch on Thursdays. And so that's a way in which we tag team. Another way I've seen is a friend of mine, they have a young families small group. And so what they do is they all meet together on 1 week. And then the second week, all the men meet. And then third week, all the women meet. And then the fourth week, all of them meet together. So whatever the rhythms may be, that makes it a little bit easier. Again, understanding all the complexities of raising little kids. I think you can find some tweaks and tools to make it still make sense for your family rhythm. And I think it's really important to build that, because you need the support even more in this season.
Yeah, no, that's some really great practical help, David. I appreciate that. We're running low on time, and so I want to ask you one more question. This one, maybe if you could just give some hope for what community looks like. I know you wrote about this in your book. You talked about your small group. Maybe can you just give some hope, and for people who are like, is it really worth it, to pursue this community that you're talking about? Can you give any hope what it would look like, how it would change somebody's life?
Yeah. So we all know this as Christians and followers of Jesus, that God made us in community for community. And
Mhm.
community is truly God's gift to us. And I get it. Sometimes there's pain and sometimes we have conflict and we navigate through all sorts of things. But at the end of the day, the kind of grace that is offered and embodied, and the love and support and care and the prayers that we receive, oh, how desperately we need that in our lives. And as we build these communities, one of the most beautiful gifts of the community, I believe, is, again, that's why it's a final and the fifth practice, accountability. When I have friends who have journeyed with me for a long time and they have seen my history, my patterns and habits, and they come alongside and say, hey, we're not commenting and just leaving, but we are committed to you, and we are committed to your family. And in that, we've seen and we've noticed some patterns in your life that we want to talk about. And we believe that if you're able to address it, this would deepen your discipleship to Jesus. Oh boy, when I hear that, as painful as it may be, how sharpening it is, how formative it is to have friends who care deeply about me, to even go through the awkward conversations, to call out what God might be inviting me into, and to have those friends and to build those friends at the end of the day, I believe will be such a great joy to your own discipleship to Jesus, and such a gift that you're not alone in this world trying to figure out how to become a better follower of Jesus, that you have
Mhm.
people who are coming alongside to help you become all that God is already trying to do in your life. What a
Yeah.
gift that is. And so I would say, wherever you may be, take one more step in contacting that person or that church or that small group, and to show up and prioritize. That's why it's the first practice for me. And wherever you may be, just want to say, take one more step, and that's where you can begin. And
For
God will
sure.
do beautiful things through your commitment.
Yeah, absolutely. David, thank you so much for your time. I'm glad we got to spend some time chatting about this stuff. Super
Yeah.
important, and I was blessed by your book. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.